My name is Ethan Parker, and the last time my brother Brandon called me a failure, we were standing in the middle of the Columbia Tower Club with 200 of Seattle's elite watching. He just finished his toast about family legacy and building empires when he turned to me, smiled that practice smile he saves for cameras, and said loud enough for the front tables to hear that some people are born to lead and others are born to follow. And wasn't it generous of our parents to keep supporting me even though I'd never amount to anything? The room didn't gasp. A few people chuckled uncomfortably. Most just looked away and reached for their wine glasses, pretending they hadn't heard what everyone clearly had. My mother touched Brandon's arm gently, a gesture that looked like correction but was really approval. My father checked his phone. But before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. But what Brandon didn't know, what none of them knew, was that 3 days earlier I'd received a call from Nicole Chun at Forbes magazine asking if I'd be available for their annual Billionaires Under 40 cover story. She wanted to discuss how I'd built a supply chain AI company worth $2.3 billion in less than 3 years, operating entirely under an LLC structure, while my family thought I was scraping by as a freelance consultant. And she wanted to know if I'd be willing to reveal my identity publicly for the first time. Because apparently the business world had been trying to figure out who actually owned TechFlow Solutions since we'd signed contracts with half the Fortune 500. But this isn't a story about revenge, though I know that's what it'll look like when this all comes out. It's about being erased so completely by the people who are supposed to know you best that you become a ghost in your own family. It's about the particular kind of invisibility that comes from being measured against someone else's expectations and found wanting before you've even had a chance to prove what you're capable of. It's about learning that sometimes the only way to be seen is to stop trying to make yourself visible to people who've already decided you're not worth looking at. So if you've ever sat at a family dinner and felt like a stranger, if you've ever had your dreams dismissed before you could finish explaining them, if you've ever been told you're not enough by people who never bothered to ask what you were actually doing with your life, then maybe you'll understand why I spent 3 years building an empire in silence while my family threw parties celebrating mediocrity. Most mornings in the Parker household started with my mother's voice drifting up from the kitchen, bright and performative, the kind of tone she used when she was pretending everything was exactly as it should be. I'd hear her laughing with Brandon about some deal he was closing, some client he'd impressed, some article in the Seattle Times business section that mentioned Parker and Associates in glowing terms. By the time I made it downstairs, the energy would shift. Not dramatically. My mother wouldn't stop smiling. But the quality of her attention would change, the way light changes when a cloud passes over the sun. She'd ask if I wanted coffee in the same voice she used to ask the housekeeper if the dry cleaning had been picked up. I had a degree in computer science from the University of Washington. I graduated summa cum laude. I'd spent 2 years at Microsoft working on cloud infrastructure before I left to start my own company. But none of that mattered because Brandon had an MBA from Stanford and a corner office at the family firm and a fiancé whose family owned half of Bellevue. He looked the part. Tall, athletic, the kind of smile that made people trust him before he'd even said anything worth trusting. He wore suits that cost more than most people's monthly rent, and he wore them easily, like he'd been born understanding that appearance was half the battle. I wore hoodies and jeans. I worked from a cramped desk in a co-working space in Fremont that smelled like old coffee and ambition. I took meetings on my laptop in the corner booth at a diner on Capitol Hill because I couldn't afford to let potential clients see that I was running a company from a 400-square-foot apartment with a kitchen so small you couldn't open the refrigerator and the oven at the same time. But what they saw and what was actually happening were two entirely different things. While Brandon was touring properties and schmoozing with investors over $18 cocktails, I was building something that would change how global supply chains operated. I'd identified a gap in the market that nobody else was looking at because they were too busy chasing the flashy stuff, the consumer-facing apps and social media platforms. I went after the invisible infrastructure, the systems that moved products from factories to warehouses to stores, and I built an AI that could optimize those routes in real time, saving companies millions of dollars in operational costs. My first client was a mid-sized logistics company in Portland that took a chance on an unknown vendor because their current system was hemorrhaging money, and they were desperate enough to try anything. I gave them a 3-month pilot program. By month 2, they cut their fuel costs by 18% and reduced delivery delays by 30%. By month 3, they were signing a 5-year contract and asking if I could scale the system for their international operations. I said yes. Then I went home and worked 70-hour weeks for the next 6 months to make sure I could actually deliver on that promise. The second client came from a referral, then a third, then a fourth. Within a year, I had 12 clients and 4 employees working remotely. Within 2 years, I had offices in 3 cities and contracts with companies whose names everyone would recognize. And I did all of it quietly, deliberately, keeping my name off every public document, routing everything through the LLC, making sure that when people Googled TechFlow Solutions they found a professional website and a generic contact email and absolutely nothing that would lead them back to me. Because I knew what would happen if my family found out. Brandon would claim I was riding on the Parker name. My mother would worry about what people would think, whether my success would somehow diminish Brandon's accomplishments by comparison. My father would want to know why I hadn't come to him for advice, for connections, for the kind of help that came with strings attached and expectations I had no intention of meeting. So I let them think I was struggling. I let them think I was barely making rent. I showed up to family dinners in the same 3 pairs of jeans and laughed off their concern with vague comments about consulting work and ongoing prex. When my mother suggested I come work for the family business, I thanked her and said I was happy with what I was doing. When Brandon offered to introduce me to someone who was hiring at his firm, I declined politely and changed the subject. They thought I was proud, too stubborn to accept help, too naive to understand that success required compromise and networking and playing the game the way everyone else played it. What they didn't understand was that I'd already won. I just hadn't told them yet. The first time I heard Brandon call me a disappointment was at a family dinner 6 months after I'd left Microsoft. We were sitting around the table at my parents' estate on Mercer Island, the kind of house that came with a view of the water and a wine cellar and rooms that nobody ever used except when they were entertaining. My father had just finished talking about some development deal Brandon had closed, his voice full of the kind of pride he usually reserved for discussing his own accomplishments. Brandon was soaking it up, nodding modestly while managing to look pleased with himself, and my mother was beaming like he'd just been awarded a Nobel Prize. Then my father turned to me. "So Ethan," he said, "still consulting?" The word came out like something distasteful, something he had to hold at arm's length. "I'm building a software company," I said. "AI-based supply chain optimization." He nodded absently. "That's nice. Any clients yet?" "Few," I said. "It's growing." Brandon laughed. "Few clients. That's sweet. How are you paying rent?" "I have enough saved," I said. "From Microsoft," my mother added quickly, like she needed to justify my existence. He was very responsible with his savings. Brandon leaned back in his chair. "You know, little brother, there's no shame in admitting when something isn't working out. Dad could probably find you something at the firm. Nothing fancy, but it'd be steady income while you figure out what you actually want to do." "I appreciate that," I said. "But I'm good." He shrugged. "Suit yourself. Just seems like a waste, you know? You're smart enough. You just don't have the drive. Some people are built for entrepreneurship and some people aren't. Nothing wrong with being an employee." My mother made a small sound that might have been disagreement but didn't quite rise to the level of defense. My father said nothing. The conversation moved on. I went home that night and landed my biggest contract yet. $8.2 million over 3 years with a manufacturing conglomerate that operated in 14 countries. I signed the papers at 11 at night, sitting on my couch with my laptop balanced on my knees and a cold cup of coffee on the table beside me. I didn't tell anyone. The pattern repeated itself over the next 2 years. Family dinners where Brandon would talk about his deals and my parents would celebrate his wins, and I would sit quietly and answer vague questions about my work with even vaguer responses. Brandon's engagement party where Vanessa, his fiancée, asked me in front of a group of their friends what I did for a living and then said, "Oh, that's nice," when I tried to explain, before immediately turning to someone else and asking about their vacation to the Maldives. A charity gala where my mother introduced me to her friends as her younger son who works in computers, her voice taking on that particular tone of apology, like she was explaining a regrettable but permanent condition. But here's what they didn't see. Every dismissive comment, every casual insult, every moment of being overlooked, I absorbed it. Not with hurt feelings or wounded pride, but with clarity. Each interaction confirmed what I already knew. They'd made up their minds about who I was, and nothing I said would change that. So I stopped trying to explain. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I stopped trying to prove myself. I just kept working. I documented everything, though not in the way you might think. I wasn't collecting evidence of their cruelty because I didn't think of it as cruelty. It was just who they were, and I was just someone they couldn't see clearly. But I kept records of my own success. Every contract signed, every milestone reached, every piece of press coverage that mentioned TechFlow Solutions without mentioning me. I created a folder on my encrypted drive labeled simply Timeline, and I filled it with proof of what I'd been doing, while they thought I was failing. By year 3, TechFlow had 230 employees across 6 offices. Our software was running supply chain operations for 47 major corporations. We'd been approached by 3 different venture capital firms offering to buy us outright. I turned them all down. Then Horizon Equity came in with an offer that included keeping me on as CEO and letting me maintain creative control, and I said yes. Not because I needed the money, but because it was time to scale and I couldn't do it alone anymore. The deal closed on a Tuesday morning. My company was now valued at $2.3 billion. I owned 68% of it. On paper, I was worth more than my father's entire real estate portfolio. More than Brandon would likely ever see in his lifetime unless he got very lucky or very crooked. I celebrated by getting coffee from my usual place on Capitol Hill and working from home because I had 3 client calls scheduled and a product launch to finalize. 2 days later, my phone rang. Unknown number. I almost didn't answer. Hello? Is this Ethan Parker? Speaking. Mr. Parker, this is Nicole Chen. I'm a senior writer with Forbes magazine. I'm working on our annual Billionaires Under 40 feature, and your name came up in our research. I was hoping we could talk. I set down my coffee. I'd known this moment was coming eventually. You couldn't sell a company for that kind of money and stay anonymous forever. The SEC filings were public record. Anyone who wanted to dig deep enough could connect the dots. I'm listening, I said. She explained the feature. They wanted to profile me. They wanted to understand how I'd built TechFlow from nothing into a billion-dollar company in less than 3 years. They wanted to know why I'd stayed out of the press, why nobody in the Seattle tech scene seemed to know who I was, why I'd operated under an LLC structure that obscured my ownership. And they wanted to know if I'd be willing to go public. To put my name and face on the story. To let the world know that the mysterious founder of TechFlow Solutions was a 29-year-old who'd done it all while his own family thought he was barely getting by. I told her I'd think about it. She said she understood, but that she'd need an answer within the week because they were closing the issue. I hung up and sat in my apartment, looking out at the Seattle skyline. Rain was starting to fall. It always seemed to be raining in Seattle, the kind of persistent drizzle that never quite became a storm but never fully stopped either. I thought about Brandon's toast at the Columbia Tower Club. I thought about my mother's apologetic introductions. I thought about 3 years of being invisible. Then I called Nicole back and told her yes. The Columbia Tower Club sits on the 76th floor of the tallest building in Seattle, all floor-to-ceiling windows and polished marble, and the kind of quiet wealth that doesn't need to announce itself. My family had been members for 20 years, the kind of place where my father closed deals over dry-aged steaks and my mother hosted charity committee meetings over champagne and petit fours. I'd been there dozens of times, always as an accessory, someone to fill out the table when they needed an even number, or wanted to appear like a complete family unit. The dinner that night was supposed to celebrate Parker and Associates' 30th anniversary. My father had rented out the private dining room, invited every important client and business associate. He'd accumulated over 3 decades of commercial real estate development. There were state senators there, tech executives, old money families whose names were on hospital wings and university buildings. Brandon had spent the week before the event talking about nothing else, about the speech he was planning, about how this was his moment to step into a leadership role, to show everyone that he was ready to take over when my father eventually retired. I almost didn't go. I'd been in back-to-back meetings all week finalizing a contract with a pharmaceutical company that wanted to overhaul their entire distribution network. And I was exhausted in the way that comes from solving problems that actually matter while pretending to the world that you're doing nothing of consequence. But my mother had called 3 times, each call a little more insistent than the last, reminding me that this was important to the family, that my absence would be noticed, that surely I could take one evening away from whatever I was doing to support my father on this milestone. So I went. I wore the one suit I owned that didn't look like I'd bought it off a clearance rack, though it still didn't fit quite right in the shoulders, and I showed up exactly on time, which meant I was late by Parker family standards. The room was already full, the sound of conversation and laughter mixing with the soft jazz playing from hidden speakers. Everyone looked like they belonged there. Everyone except me. Brandon found me within 5 minutes. He was holding a glass of champagne and wearing a suit that probably cost what I used to make in a month at Microsoft. His hair was perfect. His smile was perfect. Everything about him was calibrated for maximum impression. "You made it," he said, and there was surprise in his voice, like he genuinely expected me not to show up. "Mom will be relieved. She was worried you'd flake." "I wouldn't miss it," I said. He looked me over, his gaze catching on my off-the-rack suit, my scuffed shoes, the fact that I was holding a glass of water instead of champagne. "Well, you're here. That's what matters. Try to mingle a little, yeah? These are important people. Good networking opportunities. You never know when you might need a real job." "I have a job," I said. "Right," he said, in that tone that meant he didn't believe me but wasn't interested in arguing about it. "Your consulting thing. How's that going?" "It's going well." Good. He clapped me on the shoulder, the gesture somewhere between brotherly and condescending. "Listen, I've got to make the rounds, but we should grab lunch sometime. I know some people who might be hiring. Nothing glamorous but steady work. Better than whatever you're doing now." He walked away before I could respond, already turning his attention to a group of executives near the windows. I watched him work the room, shaking hands, laughing at jokes that probably weren't funny, positioning himself at the center of every conversation like gravity naturally bent toward him. My mother appeared at my elbow. "You look tired," she said. "Are you sleeping enough?" "I'm fine, Mom. You work too hard. All those hours in front of a computer can't be healthy." She adjusted the collar of my shirt like I was 12 years old. "You should take better care of yourself. Maybe think about a more structured schedule. Your father always says that discipline is the foundation of success." I wanted to tell her that I had plenty of discipline, that I'd built something from nothing while working longer hours than anyone in this room could probably imagine. That the reason I looked tired was because I'd spent the previous night on a video call with clients in Singapore finalizing a deployment schedule that would save them $40 million over the next 2 years. But I didn't. Because I'd learned that explaining myself to my family was like trying to describe color to someone who'd only ever seen in black and white. They simply didn't have the framework to understand what I was telling them. Dinner was served at 8. Long tables arranged in a U-shape, everyone seated according to some invisible hierarchy that my mother had orchestrated. I was placed near the end of one arm, between a lawyer I'd never met and an empty chair that eventually filled with someone's assistant who looked as uncomfortable as I felt. Brandon was at the head table next to my father, Vanessa on his other side looking radiant in a dress that probably cost more than my rent. The meal passed in courses that seemed designed more for presentation than consumption. Tiny portions of things I couldn't identify. Each plate a work of art that disappeared in 3 bites. I made small talk with the lawyer, who asked what I did and then glazed over when I tried to explain supply chain optimization. The assistant didn't try to talk to me at all, just checked her phone under the table and picked at her food. After dessert, my father stood up. The room fell silent immediately, that particular kind of attentive quiet that important men command without having to ask for it. He talked about building Parker and Associates from a single property into a portfolio that spanned the Pacific Northwest. He talked about integrity and vision, and the importance of family legacy. He thanked his wife, my mother, who smiled graciously and didn't mention that she'd spent 30 years managing his calendar and smoothing over his mistakes, and making sure everyone thought he was exactly as impressive as he believed himself to be. Then he called Brandon up to speak. My brother took the microphone like he'd been born holding it. He thanked our father, praised the company, talked about the future in broad, confident strokes that didn't actually commit to any specific vision but sounded impressive enough that people nodded along. He was good at this. He'd always been good at this. The performance of success, the appearance of leadership, the ability to make people believe that confidence and competence were the same thing. And then he looked directly at me. "I also want to take a moment to talk about family," Brandon said, his voice warm and intimate like he was sharing something personal. Because success isn't just about what we build professionally. It's about the people who support us, who believe in us, even when things don't go according to plan. I felt something tighten in my chest. I knew that tone. I'd heard it before, usually right before he said something that sounded generous but was actually cruel. My younger brother Ethan is here tonight, and I just want to say how much I admire his persistence. He's been trying to make it on his own in the tech world, and even though it hasn't quite worked out the way he hoped, he keeps showing up. He keeps trying. And I think that says something about character. Because some people are born to lead, and some people are born to support those leaders, and there's dignity in both roles. Not everyone can build an empire, but everyone can contribute in their own way. He smiled at me. A few people turned to look. Most kept their eyes on Brandon, nodding along like he just said something profound. So I just want to say, little brother, we're proud of you. For not giving up. For being part of this family. And hey, if the consulting thing doesn't pan out, you know where to find us. We could always use someone good with computers. The room laughed. It was polite laughter, the kind that acknowledged a joke without committing to finding it particularly funny. But it was laughter. At my expense. In a room full of the most powerful people in Seattle, my brother had just publicly declared me a failure, and nobody was going to contradict him. My mother reached across the table and squeezed my hand. That was sweet of him, she whispered. I pulled my hand away and stood up. I needed air. I needed to be anywhere but in that room with those people who looked at me and saw exactly what my family told them to see. I walked out past tables of strangers, past my father who didn't look up from his conversation, past Brandon who was already moving on to thank someone else for something else. I made it to the hallway before Vanessa caught up with me. Ethan, wait. I stopped but didn't turn around. She came around to face me, her expression somewhere between concern and curiosity. Are you okay? That was a little harsh in there. It's fine, I said. It's not though. She lowered her voice. Look, I know Brandon can be intense, but he means well. He really does want what's best for you. I'm sure he does. She hesitated, then said something that surprised me. For what it's worth, I don't think you're a failure. I think you're trying to do something difficult, and that takes courage. Even if it doesn't work out, at least you tried. It was meant to be kind. I could see that. But it was also completely wrong, based on a complete misunderstanding of reality, and I couldn't correct her without revealing everything. So I just nodded. Thanks, I said. I appreciate that. She smiled, relieved that the awkward moment was over. Come back inside. The night's not over yet. There's going to be dancing later. And you know how your mother gets if the family isn't all together for photos. I told her I needed a few minutes and watched her walk back to the dining room. Through the windows, I could see the lights of Seattle spreading out below. Millions of people living their lives, completely unaware of the small humiliations happening 76 floors above them. My phone buzzed. A text from James Mitchell, my business partner and the only person outside of TechFlow who knew the full scope of what we'd built. The pharmaceutical deal had been signed. Contracts were executed. We were officially locked in for 5 years, $43 million guaranteed, with performance bonuses that could push it past $60 million if we hit our targets. I stood in that hallway, looking at my phone and felt absolutely nothing. Not triumph. Not satisfaction. Just a kind of hollow clarity. I had just closed a deal that was worth more than my father's biggest single project in his entire career. And in the next room, people were laughing at a joke about how I couldn't make it in the real world. I went back inside. I sat through the rest of the dinner. I smiled for the family photos my mother insisted on. I shook hands with people whose names I didn't remember, and accepted their sympathetic looks with grace. When Brandon found me again near the end of the night, slightly drunk and even more pleased with himself than usual, I let him put his arm around my shoulders and tell me that I was a good sport, that not everyone could handle being the butt of a joke with such good humor. You know I love you, right? He said. Everything I said up there, it comes from a place of wanting you to succeed. I know, I said. And if you ever want to have a real conversation about your future, about what you're actually going to do with your life, I'm here. Anytime. I appreciate that. He squeezed my shoulder and stumbled off to find Vanessa. I watched him go, watched him laugh with friends who probably didn't like him any more than they liked anyone else but knew that liking him was professionally advantageous. I watched my parents hold court near the windows, My father telling some story I'd heard a dozen times before, my mother laughing in all the right places. And I understood with perfect clarity that nothing I said to these people would matter. No explanation would suffice. No achievement would register. Because they'd decided who I was, and that decision had been made so long ago that they couldn't remember making it. It had simply become fact. Ethan is the disappointing one. Ethan is the one who doesn't have what it takes. Ethan is the one we worry about. So I stopped trying to change their minds. I went home to my small apartment, changed into comfortable clothes, made coffee and opened my laptop. I had work to do. Real work. The kind that actually mattered to people who measured success by results rather than performance. And I started planning what I would do when Forbes published their article. The weeks following the Columbia Tower Club dinner settled into a familiar rhythm, the kind of routine that felt almost comfortable in its predictability. I'd wake up early, usually before the sun managed to break through Seattle's perpetual cloud cover, and spend the first hour of my day responding to emails from clients in different time zones. Tokyo, Singapore, London, Frankfurt. TechFlow operated globally now, which meant that morning coffee came with status updates on deployments happening halfway around the world. My apartment in Capitol Hill had become a strange kind of sanctuary. 400 square feet that nobody from my family had ever visited, tucked into a building that looked like every other converted warehouse in the neighborhood. The rent was reasonable by Seattle standards, which meant it was astronomical by any rational measure. But I'd kept the place even after the Horizon equity deal closed because moving would have required explanation. Questions about where I was going, why I needed something bigger, how I could afford it. Easier to stay put and let everyone continue believing I was barely scraping by. The view from my single window looked out onto an alley where the same three people seemed to smoke cigarettes at all hours of the day and night. I'd learned their schedules by accident. The guy with the sleeve tattoos took his breaks at 7 in the morning and 3 in the afternoon. The woman with the purple hair came out around noon and again at sunset. The older man who always wore a Seahawks jacket appeared randomly, sometimes twice a day, sometimes not for a week. They never spoke to each other, just stood in their separate corners of the alley, staring at their phones or the brick wall or nothing in particular, bound together only by their shared need for nicotine and a few minutes away from whatever they were avoiding inside. I understood the impulse. Sometimes I'd stand at that window with my own coffee, not smoking but taking the same kind of break, letting my mind drift while my eyes tracked the familiar patterns. It was meditative in a way, watching other people exist in their small moments of escape. But mostly I worked. I worked the way people work when they've found something that makes sense to them in a world that otherwise feels arbitrary and chaotic. The code was logical. The problems had solutions. If something broke, you could trace it back to its source and fix it. There was no ambiguity, no performance required, no need to convince anyone of anything beyond the observable fact that the system either worked or it didn't. TechFlow had grown beyond anything I'd initially imagined. What started as a relatively simple optimization algorithm had evolved into a comprehensive platform that could handle every aspect of supply chain management from procurement to final delivery. We'd added machine learning capabilities that let the system predict disruptions before they happened, reroute shipments around weather events, adjust inventory levels based on real-time demand signals from thousands of data sources. The AI wasn't just reactive anymore. It was predictive. In some cases, it was better at forecasting market trends than the human analysts our clients employed. The pharmaceutical deal was just the latest in a series of contracts that had pushed us into a different category of company. We weren't a startup anymore, not really. We had infrastructure, processes, an HR department that handled benefits and onboarding, a legal team that reviewed contracts, a finance department that managed payroll for more than 200 people across 6 offices. I'd hired Amanda Rodriguez as COO 8 months earlier, because I'd finally accepted that I couldn't run operations and maintain the technical vision at the same time. She was brilliant, ruthlessly efficient, and had somehow managed to build organizational systems that scaled without creating the kind of bureaucratic bloat that kills innovation. She also knew who I was. Not Ethan Parker, the disappointing younger son, but Ethan Parker, the founder who'd built something real. It was disorienting sometimes, moving between those two versions of myself. At TechFlow, I was the person people came to with hard problems. In my family, I was the person people worried about in that distant, Abstract way you worry about someone you've given up on but feel obligated to keep checking on. The Forbes interview was scheduled for a Wednesday afternoon. Nicole Chun had suggested meeting at my office, but I'd steered her toward a coffee shop in Fremont instead. Neutral territory. Somewhere that wouldn't immediately reveal the scope of what I'd built. I wanted to control the narrative, decide exactly what got revealed and when. She arrived 5 minutes early, which I appreciated. Professional, prepared, the kind of person who respected other people's time. She was younger than I'd expected from her voice on the phone, probably early 30s, with an intensity that showed in the way she set up her recorder and pulled out a notebook already filled with preliminary research. "Thank you for agreeing to this," she said as we sat down with our coffee. "I have to admit, you're one of the harder subjects I've tried to profile. There's almost nothing about you online. No social media presence, no conference appearances, no press interviews. For someone who's built a billion-dollar company, you've managed to stay remarkably invisible." "That was intentional," I said. "Clearly. So let's start there. Why the secrecy? Most founders at your level are building their personal brand alongside their company. You've done the opposite." I thought about how to answer that. I'd spent weeks preparing for this conversation, anticipating questions, rehearsing responses that would sound natural rather than calculated. But now that the moment was here, I found I didn't want to perform. I was tired of performing. I wanted to build something real, I said. And I knew that if I made it about me, about my story or my background or my family, then that would become the story. The son of Robert Parker trying to prove himself. The younger brother competing with Brandon. All the personal drama that makes for interesting headlines but doesn't actually matter to whether the product works. But you're willing to go public now. Because the work speaks for itself at this point. TechFlow has proven what it can do. We have clients on 5 continents, contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars, a platform that's genuinely changing how global logistics operates. That's not going to be undermined by people finding out who founded it. She made notes, her pen moving quickly across the page. "Tell me about your family. Your father runs Parker & Associates, one of the most successful commercial real estate firms in the Pacific Northwest. Your brother Brandon is VP there, being groomed to take over. That's a lot of success to grow up around. Did that influence your decision to go into tech instead?" I chose my words carefully. My family operates in a different world. Real estate is about physical assets, location, relationships built over decades. What I do is entirely digital, global, based on systems and efficiency rather than property and prestige. They're not comparable, but they are both about building something, she pressed. About creating value. Did your family support your decision to start TechFlow? They didn't know about it, I said. Not in any real sense. They knew I was working on something, but I didn't share details. I wanted to see if I could do it without the Parker name opening doors or creating expectations. And could you? Obviously. She smiled at that. Fair enough. Walk me through the beginning. How did TechFlow start? So I told her. Not everything, but enough. About identifying the gap in the market while I was at Microsoft, seeing how much money companies were wasting on inefficient supply chain management, how the existing solutions were either too expensive for most companies to implement or too simplistic to handle real complexity. About leaving a stable job with good benefits to build something from my apartment, living on savings while I developed the first version of the platform. About landing that first client in Portland through cold outreach and desperate persistence. She took notes, asked follow-up questions, dug into technical details in a way that suggested she'd done her research on supply chain logistics before the interview. We talked for 2 hours. She wanted to know about scaling challenges, about how I'd managed to hire talented engineers while operating under an LLC structure that obscured ownership, about the decision to take funding from Horizon Equity. Why them? She asked. You turned down several other offers. Because they understood that I wasn't building a company to flip it for a quick exit. I wanted to scale sustainably, maintain control, keep the mission intact. Horizon's partnership model aligned with that. They brought resources and connections without trying to take over operations or push for changes that would compromise what we'd built. And the valuation? $2.3 billion. That puts you in a very exclusive category for your age. How does that feel? Surreal, I said honestly. Most days I don't think about it. The number is abstract. What matters is whether the platform works, whether clients are seeing results, whether we're solving real problems for real companies. But you're worth over $1 billion personally. That has to change things. Change is what's possible, I said. The resources I have access to, the scale at which I can operate. But it doesn't change what I'm trying to do or why I'm doing it. She leaned back, studying me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Can I ask you something off the record? I nodded. Does your family know about any of this? No, I said. Not yet. Are you going to tell them? Or are they going to find out when the magazine comes out? I haven't decided, I said, which was technically true even though I'd already made the decision weeks ago. Part of me thinks they deserve to hear it from me first. Part of me thinks it doesn't matter how they find out because the reaction will be the same either way. Which is? I thought about Brandon's toast at the Columbia Tower Club. About 3 years of being treated like a charity case. About my mother's gentle suggestions that I get a real job. About my father's complete lack of interest in anything I said about my work. Disbelief, I said finally, followed by trying to make it about them somehow. Either taking credit or making excuses or finding a way to diminish it, so it doesn't challenge their narrative about who I am and what I'm capable of. That sounds painful. It is what it is. She turned the recorder off and closed her notebook. For what it's worth, I think what you've built is remarkable. Not just the company, but the discipline it took to do it in silence. Most people need validation. They need recognition. You built an empire without either. I had validation, I said. From clients. From users. From the engineers who joined the team because they believed in what we were doing. That was enough. We finished our coffee and she packed up her equipment. The article would run in 3 weeks, she said. She'd send me a draft to review for factual accuracy. But the editorial team maintained final control over content and framing. Standard policy. I said I understood. After she left, I sat in the coffee shop for another hour, watching people come and go. Students with laptops and textbooks. Parents with strollers. Freelancers having meetings in corners. Everyone absorbed in their own small universes, completely unaware that they were sitting in the same room where someone had just agreed to blow up his entire family's understanding of reality. My phone buzzed. A text from my mother. Family dinner on Sunday. Don't forget. She always added that last part, as if I was constantly forgetting things, as if I needed reminders to show up for obligations. I texted back confirming I'd be there, then immediately regretted it. The article would be out by then. There was no way to avoid the conversation at that point. But walking away from the dinner felt too much like hiding, and I'd spent 3 years hiding in plain sight. If I was going to stop hiding, I might as well commit to it completely. The next 2 weeks passed in a strange kind of suspended animation. I went through the motions of running the company, attending meetings, reviewing code, making decisions that affected hundreds of employees and millions of dollars in contracts. But part of my attention was always elsewhere. Imagining the moment when my family would see the magazine, trying to anticipate reactions, rehearsing conversations that might never happen the way I imagined them. James noticed. We were in my real office, the one in Bellevue that nobody from my family knew existed, reviewing quarterly projections when he set down the spreadsheet and looked at me directly. You're distracted, he said. What's going on? Forbes article comes out next week. Right. The big reveal. How are you feeling about it? I don't know, I said honestly. Part of me is relieved. No more pretending, no more keeping track of lies about what I do or how I pay rent. But part of me knows it's going to be complicated in ways I can't entirely predict. Your family still doesn't know? I shook my head. They'll find out when everyone else does. That's bold. It's self-preservation. If I tell them first, they'll have time to shape the narrative, to decide how to respond, to make it about their feelings instead of what actually happened. This way it's public first. Undeniable. They can't revise history or claim credit, or do any of the things they'd normally do. He nodded slowly. Just make sure you're ready for the fallout. People don't like being surprised, especially when the surprise makes them look bad. They made themselves look bad, I said. I just stopped covering for them. The draft of the article arrived 5 days before publication. Nicole had sent it with a note saying she tried to be fair while telling the truth, which was about all anyone could ask for in journalism. I opened the PDF on my laptop and read it standing up in my apartment, unable to sit still. The headline was direct. The Invisible Billionaire. How Ethan Parker Built a Supply Chain Empire While His Family Thought He Was Failing. The article opened with the Columbia Tower Club scene, describing Brandon's toast in detail that made it sound even worse than I remembered. Then it pivoted to my background, the contrast between my father and brother's public success and my apparent lack of direction. It laid out the timeline of TechFlow's growth in parallel with my family's continued dismissal of my work, creating a narrative of quiet perseverance in the face of systematic underestimation. Nicole had interviewed several of my clients, who'd spoken glowingly about the platform's impact on their operations. She'd talked to Amanda Rodriguez, who described my leadership style as thoughtful and technically brilliant. She'd even found one of my professors from University of Washington, who'd apparently remembered me as one of the most talented students he'd taught in 20 years. The article ended with a quote from our interview. When asked why he chose to build in secret, Parker's answer was simple. I wanted the work to speak for itself. In a world obsessed with personal branding and social media presence, his approach feels almost radical, but the results are undeniable. TechFlow Solutions is changing global logistics, and Ethan Parker, invisible no longer, is just getting started. I read it 3 times, looking for anything that felt inaccurate or unfair. There was nothing. It was balanced, well-researched, and told exactly the story I'd lived even if I'd never quite articulated it that way before. Seeing it in print made it real in a way that living it hadn't. This was what had happened. This was who I'd been and who I'd become. And in less than a week, everyone would know. I sent Nicole an email approving the draft with no corrections needed. Then I did something I hadn't done in months. I called James and asked if he wanted to get a drink. We met at a bar in Ballard, the kind of place with dim lighting and good whiskey and enough ambient noise that you could have a conversation without being overheard. I ordered something expensive that I didn't particularly want and James got a beer, and for a while we just sat there not talking, watching a baseball game on the television above the bar. Finally he said, "You're about to become very public very quickly. Have you thought about what comes after? After the article? After the article, after the family drama, after everyone knows. What do you want your life to look like?" "I want to keep building," I said. TechFlow has momentum now. We're starting to get into manufacturing logistics, healthcare supply chains, humanitarian aid distribution. The platform can do so much more than what we've deployed so far. That's what I want to focus on. And your family? I don't know. I honestly don't know if there's a relationship to salvage there. Maybe once everything is out in the open, we can have honest conversations for the first time. Or maybe they'll be so angry about being made to look foolish that they'll cut me off entirely. Either way, I'll survive. You've already survived, James said. Everything else is just details. We finished our drinks and I went home and tried to sleep. The magazine would hit newsstands on Thursday morning. Digital version going live at midnight Pacific time. I had 3 days, 72 hours before everything changed. I spent them working because work was the only thing that had ever made sense. The Forbes article went live at midnight on Thursday. I wasn't sleeping when it happened, hadn't really expected to. I was sitting at my kitchen table with my laptop open, refreshing the Forbes homepage every few minutes like some kind of compulsion I couldn't control. When the article finally appeared, featured prominently in their business section with a photo they'd taken of me standing outside the TechFlow office in Bellevue, I felt my stomach drop in a way that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the sudden, irreversible knowledge that there was no going back now. The headline looked even more stark on the screen than it had in the draft. The Invisible Billionaire. How Ethan Parker Built a Supply Chain Empire While His Family Thought He Was Failing. Underneath was a subheading that read, at 29, the youngest son of Seattle real estate mogul Robert Parker has quietly become one of tech's most successful entrepreneurs. His family had no idea. I read through the article one more time, even though I'd already memorized every word. It felt different seeing it published, official, permanent. This wasn't a private conversation anymore. This was public record. Anyone with an internet connection could now read about Brandon's condescending toast, about my mother's apologetic introductions, about 3 years of being treated like a failure while building something that had made me wealthier than my entire family combined. My phone started buzzing almost immediately. Messages from people I hadn't heard from in years. Congratulations. I had no idea. This is incredible. Why didn't you tell anyone? The notifications piled up faster than I could read them. A constant stream of reactions from acquaintances and former classmates, and people who'd probably never thought about me at all until they saw my face on Forbes. James sent a text at 12:15. It's live. How are you holding up? I'm fine, I typed back. Just watching the internet do its thing. Your LinkedIn is about to explode, he replied. Might want to turn off notifications for a while. He was right. I opened LinkedIn out of morbid curiosity and found that I already had over 300 new connection requests. My profile, which I barely maintained for years, was suddenly being viewed thousands of times. People were commenting on the article, sharing it, tagging others. The algorithm was doing exactly what it was designed to do, taking something newsworthy and spreading it as far and wide as possible. I closed the laptop and tried to think about what tomorrow would look like. The article would be everywhere by morning. Tech blogs would pick it up, Seattle news outlets would run their own stories, business podcasts would want interviews. And somewhere in all of that noise, my family would find out. I wondered who would see it first. My mother probably didn't read Forbes, but she had friends who did, people who moved in circles where this kind of news traveled fast. Brandon definitely followed tech industry coverage, part of his attempt to seem informed and connected, even though he worked in real estate. My father might not see it at all unless someone brought it to his attention, too focused on his own deals to pay attention to business media unless it directly concerned him. It didn't matter who saw it first. What mattered was that by this time tomorrow they would all know. The carefully constructed narrative they'd built about me, the disappointing younger son who couldn't find his footing, would be revealed as completely false. And they would have to reconcile that with the fact that I'd let them believe it. That I'd sat through their condescension and their pity and their casual cruelty without ever correcting them, without ever defending myself, without giving them any indication that I was doing exactly what I'd set out to do. Sleep came eventually, sometime after 3 in the morning. When I woke up 6 hours later to weak sunlight filtering through my single window, my phone had 63 unread messages and 15 missed calls. I ignored all of them and made coffee, going through my morning routine with deliberate normalcy. Shower, coffee, checking the overnight reports from TechFlow's international operations. Everything was running smoothly. A deployment in Singapore had completed ahead of schedule. The London office had signed a new client. Normal Thursday. Morning activities for a company that now operated on 4 continents. The first call from my family came at 9:30. My mother. I stared at her name on my screen for 3 rings before deciding to answer. Ethan, she said, and her voice had a quality I'd never heard before. Something between shock and hurt and confusion. I just received a call from Margaret Whitmore. She saw an article about you in Forbes magazine. She said you've started a company, that you're worth over $1 billion. She laughed, but it sounded wrong, strained. I told her that couldn't be right, that there must be some mistake, but then I looked it up and there's your picture and I don't understand what's happening. It's not a mistake, I said. The article is accurate. Silence on the other end. Long enough that I checked to make sure the call hadn't dropped. You have $1 billion company, she finally said. You've had this company for 3 years. And you never told us. I tried to tell you, I said carefully. Multiple times. You didn't want to hear about it. We would have wanted to hear about this, Ethan. About something like this. This is extraordinary. This is the kind of success that families celebrate together. You celebrated Brandon's success, I said. I was just the disappointing one who worked with computers. That's not fair. We've always supported you. We've always wanted the best for you. You wanted me to give up and come work for the family business, I said. You wanted me to stop trying and accept that I wasn't cut out for entrepreneurship. That's not support, Mom. That's just wanting me to fit into a box that was easier for you to understand. I heard her breath catch. When she spoke again, her voice was harder. Your father is going to want to talk to you. Brandon too. This article makes them look foolish. It makes all of us look foolish. Like we didn't know our own son, our own brother. You didn't know me, I said. That's the point. You made assumptions about who I was and what I was capable of, and you never questioned those assumptions even when I tried to tell you otherwise. We're having dinner on Sunday, she said, ignoring what I just said. You need to be there. We need to discuss this as a family. I'll be there, I said, because I'd already committed to showing up and backing out now would feel like retreat. She hung up without saying goodbye. I set my phone down and finished my coffee, waiting for the next call. It came 20 minutes later. Brandon. I picked up on the first ring this time. What the hell, Ethan, he said without preamble. What the actual hell? Good morning to you too. Don't do that casual thing like this is normal. I just got off the phone with 4 different people asking me if I knew my brother was a billionaire. Do you have any idea how that makes me look? People think I'm either an idiot or a liar. They think I was lying when I said you were struggling. I was never struggling, I said. You just assumed I was. You drove a 10-year-old Honda and lived in a shitty apartment in Capitol Hill. What was I supposed to think? That appearances aren't always reality? That success doesn't have to look the way you think it looks? This is unbelievable. His voice was rising, that particular anger that came from wounded pride more than actual hurt. You made me look like a jackass in front of the entire Seattle business community. That toast I gave at the anniversary dinner is in the article, Ethan. They quoted me telling you that some people are born to lead and others are born to follow. Do you know how that reads now? Do you know what people are saying? They're probably saying you shouldn't make assumptions about people you clearly know nothing about, I said. He made a sound that might have been a laugh but came out more like a bark. You think you're so smart. You think you've proved something. But all you've done is make yourself look petty. Building a company in secret, just so you could embarrass your family when you revealed it? That's not impressive. That's pathetic. I didn't build it to embarrass you, I said. I built it because it needed to be built. Because I saw a problem that needed solving and I had the skills to solve it. You're not the center of this story, Brandon. You never were. The family dinner on Sunday is going to be very interesting, he said. I hope you're ready for it. He hung up before I could respond. I added his name to the list of calls I'd received and wondered if my father would bother reaching out or if he'd just wait until Sunday to confront me in person. The pattern held. No call from Robert Parker. Just silence, which was somehow more telling than anything my mother or Brandon had said. The rest of Thursday and all of Friday passed in a blur of media requests and messages from people I'd gone to school with, worked with, met once at a conference 3 years ago and never spoken to since. Everyone wanted something. An interview, an explanation, advice on their own startup, an introduction to investors, a chance to pitch me their idea. I ignored most of it, responding only to the few people who seemed genuinely happy for me without wanting anything in return. TechFlow's office was chaos in the best possible way. The PR team was handling interview requests, setting up a media strategy that would let me control the narrative instead of being reactive. Amanda Rodriguez had somehow managed to keep operations running smoothly despite the sudden influx of attention. We had 3 new client inquiries from major corporations who'd read the article and wanted to know more about the platform. The article had done exactly what I'd hoped it would do, shifting the conversation from who I was to what I'd built. Saturday I spent alone deliberately. I went for a long walk through Capitol Hill, past my apartment and the coffee shop where I'd met with Nicole, and the co-working space where I'd spent those first desperate months building the initial version of TechFlow. The neighborhood looked the same as it always had, which felt strange given how much had changed. I'd expected the world to look different somehow, transformed by revelation. But it was just Seattle on a gray Saturday, people living their lives, the city indifferent to my personal drama. Sunday morning arrived with the kind of relentless inevitability that made resistance pointless. I got dressed in clothes that fell somewhere between respectful and defiant, jeans that were clean but not new, a button-down shirt that fit well but wasn't expensive. I wasn't trying to prove anything with my appearance, but I also wasn't going to show up looking like I'd been defeated. The drive to my parents' estate on Mercer Island took 30 minutes through light traffic. I'd made this drive hundreds of times, but it felt different now. I wasn't going as the disappointment, the one they worried about, the one they made excuses for. I was going as someone who'd built something remarkable, and they were going to have to acknowledge that whether they wanted to or not. The house looked exactly as it always did. Imposing perfectly. Maintained, the kind of property that appeared in architectural magazines and real estate listings for comparable homes. My father's Tesla was in the driveway along with Brandon's Range Rover, and a car I didn't recognize that probably belonged to Vanessa. I parked on the street, a small act of separation, maintaining the boundary between their world and mine. My mother answered the door before I could knock. She looked tired, older somehow, like the last 3 days had aged her in ways that time alone couldn't account for. "Everyone's in the dining room," she said without greeting me. "Your father wants to talk." "Of course he does," I said. She led me through the house I'd grown up in, past the living room where we used to open Christmas presents, Past the study where my father worked late into the night on deals that were always more important than helping with homework or attending school events. The dining room table was set for 5 people, formal china that my mother only brought out for special occasions. I wondered if she considered this a special occasion or just important enough to require the good dishes. My father sat at the head of the table. Brandon was to his right, Vanessa beside him looking uncomfortable. My mother took her seat to my father's left, leaving the chair at the far end for me. The symbolism wasn't subtle. Me on one end, the rest of them clustered together on the other. A physical representation of the divide that had always existed, but was now impossible to ignore. "Sit down," my father said. It wasn't a request. I sat. Nobody spoke for a long moment. My father was studying me the way he studied properties he was considering purchasing, looking for flaws, calculating value, determining whether the investment would pay off. $2.3 billion, he finally said. That's what the article claims your company is worth. That's what Horizon Equity valued it at when they took their stake, I said. The actual market value could be higher or lower depending on a number of factors. Don't be cute, Brandon said. You know what he's asking. I'm answering the question he asked, I said without looking at Brandon. My father held up a hand, silencing Brandon without a word. Why didn't you tell us, Ethan? That's what I want to understand. You built something extraordinary, something that should have made your family proud, and you hid it from us. Why? Because you wouldn't have believed me, I said. If I told you 3 years ago that I was starting a supply chain optimization company, you would have nodded politely and then gone back to dismissing me as the son who couldn't find his place. If I told you 2 years ago that I'd signed my first major contract, you would have said that's nice and changed the subject. If I told you a year ago that I was worth hundreds of millions of dollars, you would have assumed I was exaggerating or delusional. That's not true, my mother said quietly. We would have listened. You didn't listen when I tried to explain what I was doing, I said, turning to her. You smiled and patted my hand and suggested I think about getting a more stable job. Brandon literally told me I didn't have what it takes to be an entrepreneur. In front of a room full of people. At a celebration that was supposed to be about family. That was taken out of context in the article, Brandon said. I was trying to be supportive in my own way. You told me some people are born to lead and others are born to follow, I said. You told me there was dignity in being an employee, in supporting the people who actually build things. What context makes that supportive? Boys, my father said sharply. This isn't productive. What's done is done. The question now is how we move forward. Move forward, I repeated. What does that mean? It means we're family, he said. It means that despite this unfortunate situation, we need to present a united front. The article has generated significant attention, much of it focused on our family dynamics rather than your business accomplishments. That's not good for anyone. So we need to craft a response that shows we're proud of you, that we supported you even if we didn't fully understand what you were building. You want me to lie, I said. You want me to tell people that you supported me when the public record clearly shows otherwise. I want you to remember that you're a Parker, he said. That name means something in this city. It opens doors. It creates opportunities. You've built your success, and that's admirable, but don't forget that you built it with the foundation this family provided. The education we paid for. The connections we gave you access to. The values we instilled. I paid for my own education with scholarships and student loans, I said. I didn't use family connections because I specifically avoided trading on the Parker name. And the values you instilled? The main value I learned from this family was that appearance matters more than reality, that who you know matters more than what you can do, and that success is only real if it looks the way you think it should look. My mother made a small sound of distress. Vanessa was staring at her plate like she wished she could disappear. Brandon's face had gone red. You ungrateful little shit, Brandon said. Everything we've done has been to help you, to protect you from your own worst instincts. And this is how you repay us? By humiliating us in a national magazine? I didn't humiliate you, I said, my voice level. I told the truth. If the truth is humiliating, that's not my fault. Enough, my father said. He stood up and everyone else went quiet. I've built Parker and Associates over 30 years. I've created jobs, developed properties that changed the Seattle skyline, established a reputation that will outlast all of us. And I did it with integrity and family loyalty. What you've done, Ethan, is impressive from a technical and financial standpoint. But you've done it at the expense of family unity. You've chosen to make us look foolish rather than bringing us into your success. That's a failure of character, regardless of how much your company is worth. I stood up too. I didn't choose to make you look foolish. I chose to build something real without interference or judgment. You made yourselves look foolish by assuming you knew everything about me when you clearly knew nothing. I tried to tell you what I was doing. Multiple times. You didn't want to hear it because it didn't fit your narrative. That's not my failure. That's yours. Get out, my father said quietly. Get out of my house. I'm leaving, I said. But let's be clear about what's happening here. I came today willing to have an honest conversation about what happened and why. You wanted to lecture me about family loyalty and make me responsible for your embarrassment. That tells me everything I need to know about whether there's a relationship here worth salvaging. You're making a mistake, my mother said, tears in her eyes. Family is everything. You can't just walk away. I'm not walking away, I said. I'm choosing not to stay somewhere I'm not actually wanted. Unless I'm willing to pretend the last 3 years didn't happen the way they happened. There's a difference. I walked out before anyone could respond. Made it to my car before my hands started shaking. Sat in the driver's seat for 5 minutes, breathing slowly, waiting for the adrenaline to fade. Through the large windows of the dining room, I could see my family still sitting at the table. My father saying something while Brandon nodded and my mother cried and Vanessa maintained her uncomfortable silence. I started the car and drove away. Not back to Capitol Hill but toward Bellevue, toward the office where my real work happened, where people valued me for what I could actually do rather than how well I fit into their expectations. The fallout from the family dinner continued over the following weeks, but it was distant, filtered through messages I mostly ignored. My mother sent long texts about healing and forgiveness, and the importance of family that seemed to place all the responsibility for reconciliation on me. Brandon posted on social media about the importance of humility and remembering where you came from, which everyone understood was directed at me even though he never mentioned me by name. My father said nothing publicly, which was somehow worse than if he'd lashed out. But the business kept growing. We signed 6 new major contracts in the month after the Forbes article. I did interviews with TechCrunch and Wired and the Wall Street Journal, all of them focused on the platform and the technology rather than the family drama. Amanda and I hired 30 new engineers. We opened an office in Austin. The work continued, which was the only thing that had ever really mattered. 3 months after the article came out, I moved out of my Capitol Hill apartment into a condo in Bellevue with actual space and natural light, and a view that didn't involve an alley. It felt like shedding skin, leaving behind the place where I'd spent 3 years pretending to be struggling while building something extraordinary. The new place was nice but not ostentatious, comfortable without being showy, which felt right for who I actually was rather than who anyone expected me to be. I heard through mutual acquaintances that my family had started telling people they'd always known I would be successful, that they'd supported my entrepreneurial ambitions from the beginning, that the Forbes article had mischaracterized their relationship with me. I didn't bother correcting the narrative. Let them save face if that's what they needed. The people who mattered knew the truth. One evening in late fall, I was working late at the office when Amanda knocked on my door. "There's someone here to see you," she said. "Says it's personal." I told her you don't take unscheduled meetings, but she's insistent. "Who is it?" "Vanessa Sterling. Your brother's fiancée." I considered sending her away, but curiosity won out. "Send her in." Vanessa entered looking nervous, which was new. I'd never seen her uncertain about anything. She usually moved through the world with the confidence of someone who'd always gotten exactly what she wanted. "Thank you for seeing me," she said, sitting down without being invited. "I know I don't have any right to ask for your time." "What do you want, Vanessa?" She took a breath. I wanted to apologize. For that night at the Columbia Tower Club. I told you then that I didn't think you were a failure, but I still participated in the system that treated you like one. I still laughed at jokes about you. I still let Brandon say things that I knew were cruel without calling him out. And I'm sorry for that. I waited, sensing there was more. I also wanted you to know that Brandon and I aren't getting married. I broke off the engagement 2 weeks ago. Because of this? Because of what happened with my family? Partly, she said. But mostly because watching how he reacted to your success showed me something I'd been ignoring. He doesn't actually care about achievement or innovation or building things that matter. He cares about status and appearance and being seen as successful. And I realized I didn't want to spend my life with someone like that. I'm sorry, I said, and meant it. That can't have been easy. It wasn't. But it was necessary. She stood up. I'm not asking for forgiveness or friendship or anything from you. I just wanted you to know that some people saw what really happened. And some of us are trying to do better. After she left, I sat in my office looking out at the Bellevue skyline. The lights of the city spread out below. Thousands of people living their lives, making their choices, building their futures. Somewhere out there, my family was probably having dinner, maintaining the fiction that everything was fine, that the uncomfortable truth revealed by a magazine article hadn't fundamentally changed their understanding of themselves and each other. But that wasn't my problem anymore. I'd built what I set out to build. I'd proved what I needed to prove, if only to myself. And I'd learned that sometimes the people who are supposed to know you best are the ones who see you least clearly, too invested in their own narratives to recognize who you actually are. The work continued. TechFlow kept growing. I kept building. And if my family never understood what I'd accomplished or why it mattered, that was their loss, not mine. 6 months later, Forbes ran a follow-up piece. The Invisible Billionaire. Where is he now? It detailed TechFlow's continued growth, the expansion into new markets, the humanitarian applications we'd started developing for disaster relief logistics. It mentioned in passing that I remained estranged from my family, but that I seemed unbothered by it, focused on the work rather than the drama. The final paragraph quoted something I'd said in the interview. Success doesn't require anyone's permission or validation. It just requires showing up every day and doing the work, even when nobody's watching, even when nobody believes in what you're building. The people who can do that don't need recognition. They just need purpose. I read it once, approved it, and moved on. Because that was the truth I'd learned over 3 years of building in silence. The work itself was the reward. Everything else was just noise. And in the end, I'd built something that mattered more than my family's approval, more than Brandon's recognition, more than my father's pride. I'd built a company that solved real problems for real people. I'd created jobs and opportunities and technologies that made the world function more efficiently. I'd done it my way on my terms without compromise or apology. People still called it revenge sometimes, the way I'd revealed my success to a family that had spent years dismissing me. But it was never about revenge. It was about refusing to be defined by other people's limitations. It was about trusting myself when nobody else did. It was about understanding that the loudest voices aren't always right, and that sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one actually changing the world. My name is Ethan Parker. I built a billion-dollar company while my family thought I was failing, and I did it not to prove them wrong but to prove myself right. That made all the difference. The year after the Forbes article changed things in ways I hadn't fully anticipated. Not just professionally, where TechFlow's profile had risen to the point that we were being courted by every major tech conference and industry publication, but personally in the quiet spaces where I'd grown accustomed to operating alone. Success, it turned out, had a gravity all its own. It pulled people toward you, some genuine, many opportunistic, all of them wanting something from the story you represented. I'd moved into the Bellevue condo in November, right as Seattle's winter was settling in with its characteristic gloom. The space was 3 times the size of my Capitol Hill apartment, with windows that actually let in light when the sun bothered to appear, and a kitchen where you could open the refrigerator without blocking the entire walkway. It should have felt like an upgrade, a tangible marker of how far I'd come. Instead, it mostly felt empty. Not in a bad way, just in the way that happens when you've spent so long focused on building something external that you haven't bothered to build much of an internal life to go with it. I furnished it slowly, deliberately, buying things because I actually needed them rather than because they projected the right image. A good couch because I spent evenings reading technical papers. A proper desk because my laptop deserved better than a kitchen table. Art for the walls, not expensive pieces chosen by a decorator, but photographs from local artists I discovered at a gallery in Pioneer Square. The condo became mine in increments, each addition a small declaration that I was allowed to occupy space comfortably, that success didn't require performance or pretense. Work consumed most of my time, but that was by choice rather than necessity. TechFlow had grown to the point where I could have stepped back, Let Amanda and the executive team handle operations while I played the role of visionary founder who showed up for board meetings and keynote speeches. Some of the venture capitalists who tried to invest in earlier rounds suggested exactly that, framing it as the natural evolution of a successful founder. You've proved you can build it, they said. Now let other people run it while you think about what's next. But I didn't want to think about what was next. I wanted to keep building what I'd started. The humanitarian logistics project had become my obsession over the winter months, a way to apply everything we'd learned about supply chain optimization to problems that actually save lives rather than just improving profit margins. Natural disasters, refugee crises, pandemic response, all of them had logistics challenges at their core. Getting supplies to the right place at the right time was often the difference between life and death, and most humanitarian organizations were operating with systems that were decades out of date. We'd started with a pilot program in partnership with 3 NGOs working in East Africa. Drought conditions had displaced hundreds of thousands of people, and the existing aid distribution networks were overwhelmed and inefficient. Our platform could track supplies in real time, optimize delivery routes based on road conditions and security concerns, predict shortages before they became critical, and coordinate between multiple organizations that were often duplicating efforts or leaving gaps in coverage. The results were immediate and measurable. Distribution times cut by 40%. Waste reduced by 35%. And most importantly, supplies reaching people who needed them days or sometimes weeks faster than the old systems allowed. It wasn't profitable work, not in the traditional sense. We charged the NGOs a fraction of what we charged corporate clients, sometimes nothing at all if they were operating in particularly challenging conditions. But it felt like the most important thing TechFlow had ever done. I was in the office late one Thursday evening in February, reviewing deployment schedules for an expansion of the humanitarian program into South Asia, when my phone rang. Unknown number, but with the Seattle area code. I almost let it go to voicemail, but something made me answer. The voice on the other end was hesitant, younger than I expected. Mr. Parker? My name is Sophie Brennan. I'm a graduate student at University of Washington, studying supply chain management and humanitarian response. I read about your work with the East Africa project, and I was wondering if you might have time to talk about it. I'm writing my thesis on technology applications in disaster relief, and your platform is exactly the kind of innovation I'm researching. I should have referred her to our PR team or suggested she send questions by email. That's what Amanda had set up protocols for, a way to handle the constant stream of requests that came in now. But there was something in her voice, an earnestness that reminded me of myself 5 years earlier, trying to explain an idea that made perfect sense to me, but that nobody else seemed to see the value in. Are you free now? I asked. She was. We talked for over an hour, her asking sharp, informed questions about the technical architecture and the challenges of adapting a platform built for corporate logistics to the chaos of humanitarian crises. She'd done her homework, read every article about TechFlow, understood not just what we built but why it mattered. Halfway through the conversation, I realized I was enjoying myself in a way I rarely did anymore in professional contexts. This wasn't networking or positioning or any of the performance aspects of success. This was just 2 people who cared about the same problem, thinking through solutions together. You should come by the office, I said when we were wrapping up. See the platform in action. Talk to the team that's actually doing the implementation. She sounded startled. Really? That would be incredible. I don't want to impose, though. You're not imposing. Tuesday afternoon work for you? We set it up and I found myself looking forward to it in a way that surprised me. When Tuesday came, Sophie arrived exactly on time, nervous but clearly excited, carrying a worn backpack and a notebook already filled with research. She was younger than I'd imagined from our phone call, probably mid-20s, with the kind of intense focus that comes from genuinely caring about your subject rather than just trying to get through a degree program. I introduced her to the team working on the humanitarian projects. They walked her through the platform, showed her real-time data from current deployments, explained the challenges they were solving, and the ones they were still working on. She asked questions that made the engineers light up, the kind of questions that showed she understood both the technical complexity and the human stakes. After a few hours, we ended up in my office. She looked overwhelmed in the best possible way, like someone who'd just seen proof that the thing they'd been hoping was possible actually existed. This is extraordinary, she said. The way you've adapted the commercial platform to handle unpredictable conditions, the machine learning that accounts for infrastructure degradation, the coordination protocols between organizations that usually compete for resources. It's exactly what the humanitarian sector has needed for years. So why hasn't anyone else built it? I asked. She considered the question carefully. I think because it requires two things that rarely exist in the same person or organization: technical expertise at a very high level, and genuine commitment to humanitarian principles over profit. Most tech companies that could build this are focused on commercial applications because that's where the money is. And most humanitarian organizations that care about the mission don't have the technical capacity or resources to develop something this sophisticated. That's probably accurate, I said. We're only able to do it because the commercial side of TechFlow is successful enough to subsidize the humanitarian work. But even that wouldn't matter if the team wasn't committed to it. You can't do this kind of work well if you're just doing it for good PR. Is that why you started it? For something beyond profit? I thought about how to answer that. Partly. But also because once you've solved the basic problem of supply chain optimization, the most interesting applications aren't in helping corporations save money on shipping costs. They're in using those same principles to solve problems that actually matter. Getting medicine to remote clinics. Coordinating food distribution during famines. Positioning supplies before disasters hit instead of scrambling to respond after. She was quiet for a moment, then said something that caught me off guard. Can I ask you a personal question? Sure. The Forbes article about you and your family, the way they dismissed what you were building, did that drive you? The wanting to prove them wrong? I'd been asked versions of this question dozens of times by journalists and podcast hosts and people at conferences. I usually gave some diplomatic answer about focusing on the work rather than external validation. But sitting there with Sophie, who'd asked it not as a gotcha question but out of genuine curiosity, I found myself telling the truth. No, I said. Not really. I mean, there was probably some element of that early on. But the thing about proving people wrong is that it only matters if you still care what they think. And somewhere in the process of building TechFlow, I stopped caring. Not out of spite or anger, but just because I got absorbed in the actual work. The problems were interesting. The solutions mattered. And that became more important than what my family thought about any of it. Do you ever talk to them now? Not really. My mother sends texts occasionally. Birthday wishes, holiday greetings, that kind of thing. I respond politely. Brandon and my father, nothing. And that's fine. Some relationships aren't salvageable. And trying to salvage them just because their family feels like honoring obligation over honesty. That must be hard. As I said. Past tense. Now it's just reality. They chose to see me a certain way, and when that turned out to be completely wrong, they couldn't adjust. So we don't have a relationship anymore. That's their loss more than mine. She nodded slowly. For what it's worth, I think what you built is more impressive because you did it without their support. It would have been easier with family backing you, but it wouldn't have meant as much. After Sophie left, I sat in my office thinking about that conversation. About how rare it was to talk to someone who asked real questions without an agenda behind them. About how most of my interactions now were transactional in ways that hadn't been true when I was nobody, when people talked to me because they wanted to talk to me rather than because of what I represented or what I might be able to do for them. The humanitarian project continued expanding through the spring. We added deployments in Southeast Asia after a devastating typhoon season, worked with organizations responding to a refugee crisis in South America, developed protocols for pandemic supply distribution that got picked up by several public health agencies. The commercial side of TechFlow kept growing too, but it felt almost routine now. New clients, bigger contracts, international expansion. Important, necessary, but not where my attention was focused. In May, I got an invitation to speak at a conference on technology and social impact. Normally I turned these down, preferring to let Amanda or other team members represent TechFlow publicly. But this one was different. The keynote was being given by someone I'd been following for years, a researcher who'd done groundbreaking work on using data science to predict and prevent humanitarian crises. I accepted, less because I wanted to speak and more because I wanted to be in the audience for her presentation. The conference was in San Francisco, 3 days of panels and networking events and the kind of aggressive optimism that tech gatherings always had, everyone convinced that the right algorithm or platform or innovation could solve any problem. I found it exhausting, all that performative enthusiasm, but I suffered through the first day of panels because the keynote was that evening. Dr. Amara Okonkwo turned out to be even more impressive in person than her research suggested. She spoke for 45 minutes without notes, laying out a framework for predictive intervention in humanitarian crises that was both technically sophisticated and deeply grounded in understanding the human realities of displacement and disaster. She didn't oversimplify or promise technological solutions to political problems. She just showed with data and case studies and clear-eyed analysis where technology could actually help and where it couldn't. I approached her afterward during the reception, half expecting her to be surrounded by people wanting her attention. She was, but she saw me trying to navigate the crowd and waved me over. "Ethan Parker," she said like we were old friends. "I've been wanting to meet you. Your humanitarian logistics platform is doing exactly the kind of work I was talking about up there. Real applications, measurable impact, none of the Silicon Valley savior complex that usually comes with tech solutions to social problems. Your keynote was brilliant," I said. "The framework you laid out for predictive intervention, have you thought about implementation? Because I think our platform could support a lot of what you're describing." Her eyes lit up. "I was hoping you'd say that. Do you have time tomorrow to talk? Really talk, not just conference small talk?" We met for breakfast the next morning at a cafe away from the conference venue. She brought a laptop and a notebook filled with ideas, and we spent 3 hours going through how TechFlow's platform could integrate with her predictive models. By the time we finished, we'd sketched out a partnership that could fundamentally change how humanitarian organizations prepared for and responded to crises. Over the next several months, that partnership became one of the most important things TechFlow was working on. Dr. Okonkwo joined our advisory board. We embedded several of our engineers with her research team. We started building out capabilities that went beyond reactive logistics optimization to proactive positioning of supplies and personnel based on predictive risk modeling. It was ambitious to the point of being almost absurdly complex. We were trying to account for weather patterns, political instability, disease outbreak probability, infrastructure vulnerability, population movement, and dozens of other factors, then use all of that to optimize not just response but preparation. The technical challenges were enormous. The ethical considerations were even bigger. We were making decisions that would affect real people's lives, and we needed to get it right. But it was working. By late summer, we'd successfully predicted and prepared for a flood that displaced over 100,000 people, positioning supplies 2 days before the disaster hit instead of scrambling to respond after. We'd identified emerging food security risks in 3 different regions and worked with local organizations to address them before they became full-blown crises. We weren't perfect. We couldn't prevent disasters or solve the underlying political and economic issues that made people vulnerable. But we could make the response faster and more effective, and that translated directly into lives saved and suffering reduced. The work consumed me in the best possible way. I was spending 16-hour days solving problems that actually mattered, working with people who cared about impact over profit, building something that would outlast any individual ego or achievement. TechFlow's valuation kept climbing, the commercial business kept expanding, but none of that felt as important as the humanitarian applications. In September, Sophie Brennan defended her thesis. She'd written extensively about TechFlow's humanitarian platform, using it as a case study for how technology could be deployed effectively in disaster relief contexts. I attended her defense, sitting in the back of a small auditorium at University of Washington while she presented to her committee. She was confident, articulate, clearly passionate about the work. When her committee unanimously approved the thesis with distinction, I felt genuinely proud in a way that had nothing to do with TechFlow being featured prominently in her research. Afterward, at a small celebration her friends had organized, she came over to thank me. "Your platform was the perfect case study," she said. "But more than that, getting to see it in action, understanding how it actually works in real-world conditions, that's what made the thesis possible. So thank you. What's next for you?" I asked. She hesitated, then said, "I've been offered a position with one of the NGOs we partner with. Field coordination in East Africa. It's what I've been working toward, getting to do this work on the ground instead of just studying it. But I'm also terrified I'm not ready." "You're ready," I said. "And if you ever need support or resources or just someone to talk through challenges with, TechFlow is here." That's not an empty offer. I mean it. She looked relieved. "Thank you. That means more than you probably realize. Watching her leave that celebration, heading toward the work she'd been preparing for, I felt something shift. Not a dramatic revelation, but a quiet recognition that success wasn't just about building something valuable. It was about using that success to create opportunities for other people to build valuable things. To clear paths, provide resources, offer support to people who were trying to do work that mattered. The anniversary of the Forbes article came and went without much acknowledgement from me. A year since my family had found out what I'd actually been building. A year of estrangement that had stopped feeling painful and started just feeling like fact. I'd had dinner with my mother twice in that year. Strained conversations where we carefully avoided talking about anything substantive. I'd seen Brandon from a distance at a business conference, close enough to make eye contact but far enough that neither of us had to decide whether to acknowledge the other. My father remained a complete absence, and I'd stopped expecting that to change. But I'd built other relationships, found other connections. The TechFlow team had become something like family, bound together by shared purpose rather than shared DNA. Dr. Okonkwo and I talked weekly, pushing each other's thinking on how to make the humanitarian work more effective. Sophie sent updates from the field, describing challenges and small victories in equal measure. James remained my closest friend and most trusted advisor, the one person who'd known me before Forbes and still treated me exactly the same after. In November, we got word that the United Nations was interested in licensing our humanitarian platform for use in their disaster response coordination. It would be the largest deployment yet, potentially affecting millions of people across dozens of countries. The negotiations were complex, the technical requirements enormous, but if we could pull it off, it would represent exactly what I'd been hoping TechFlow could become. Not just a successful commercial enterprise, but a tool for making the world function better in the ways that mattered most. I was in the office late one evening, reviewing the UN proposal with Amanda, when my phone rang. My mother. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. "Ethan," she said, and her voice sounded different. Smaller somehow. "I need to tell you something. Your father had a heart attack this afternoon. He's stable now, but it was serious. He's at Swedish Medical Center if you want to come." "I'll be there in 20 minutes, I said. The drive to the hospital felt surreal. Like moving through a dream where nothing quite made sense. I hadn't seen my father in over a year. We'd had no contact, no communication, nothing that suggested he thought about me at all or wanted me in his life. But he was still my father, and hearing that he might have died produced a response that overrode all the rational distance I'd built. My mother was in the cardiac ICU waiting room when I arrived. She looked exhausted, frightened in a way I'd never seen her. Brandon was there too, pacing near the windows, and Vanessa sitting quietly in a corner even though she wasn't supposed to be part of this family anymore. "Mom," I said, and she stood up and hugged me, holding on longer than I expected. "Thank you for coming," she said. "I wasn't sure you would." "How is he?" "Stable. They did an angioplasty. He'll need surgery but not tonight. The doctors say he was lucky. If he'd been alone when it happened, if he hadn't been in a meeting where people noticed and called 911 immediately, it could have been much worse." Brandon came over. His expression was complicated, somewhere between relief that I'd shown up and resentment that I had any right to be there. "Dad's asking for you," he said. When he woke up after the procedure, "Your name was the first thing he said." That surprised me enough that I didn't immediately respond. "Room 412, my mother said. "They're only allowing family in, one at a time. I can take you." She led me through corridors that smelled like antiseptic and fear, past rooms where other families were having their own crises, their own moments of reckoning with mortality. My father's room was at the end of the hallway, monitors beeping softly, for lines snaking from his arm to bags of fluid hanging beside the bed. He looked smaller than I remembered. Older. The invincibility that he'd always projected, the sense that Robert Parker was too important and too powerful to be touched by ordinary human vulnerability, was completely gone. He was just a man in a hospital bed, scared and diminished by his own body's betrayal. His eyes opened when I entered. He stared at me for a long moment like he was trying to remember who I was or why I mattered. "Ethan," he finally said. "You came. Mom called." I sat down in the chair beside the bed. "How are you feeling?" "Like someone tried to kill me from the inside." He tried to smile but couldn't quite manage it. "The doctors say I need to make changes." Less stress, better diet, exercise. All the things I've been ignoring for 30 years. Probably good advice. We sat in silence for a while, the monitors filling the space between us with their steady rhythm. Finally, he said, I've been an idiot. About what? About you. About everything. He closed his eyes. When that article came out, when I saw what you'd actually built, my first reaction wasn't pride. It was anger. Anger that you'd made me look foolish, that you'd succeeded without my help or approval, that you'd proven you didn't need anything I had to offer. That's not how a father should react to his son's success. No, I said quietly. It's not. I convinced myself you'd gotten lucky, that you'd built something trendy that would collapse when the market corrected, that you didn't have what it takes for sustained success. And then I watched you keep building, keep growing, turn your company into something that actually matters beyond just making money. And I had to confront the fact that I was wrong about you. Completely wrong. And that I'd wasted years treating you like a disappointment when you were actually the most impressive person in the family. I didn't know what to say to that. Part of me wanted to accept the apology, to let this hospital room be the place where we repaired what had been broken. But another part of me, the part that had spent 3 years being dismissed and another year being ignored, wasn't ready to forgive just because mortality had suddenly made my father reflective. I appreciate you saying that, I finally said. But you weren't just wrong about me, Dad. You were cruel. You let Brandon humiliate me publicly. You never once asked real questions about what I was doing or whether I might actually know what I was talking about. You decided I was a failure and you treated me like one, and the only reason you're reconsidering now is because the world forced you to see evidence you couldn't ignore. You're right, he said. All of that is true, and I can't undo it. I can only tell you that I'm sorry, and that I want to do better. If you'll give me the chance. I don't know if I will, I said honestly. I don't know if there's a relationship here to repair or if too much damage has been done, but I didn't come here to have that conversation while you're lying in a hospital bed. I came because you're my father and you could have died today. That's enough reason. His eyes filled with tears. I've been a terrible father to you. Yeah, I said. You have been. But you've got time now to decide whether you want to keep being terrible or whether you want to try being better. That's up to you. I stayed for another 20 minutes, talking about nothing important, letting him know I was there, even if I couldn't promise anything beyond that moment. When a nurse came in to check his vitals, I used it as an excuse to leave. My mother was still in the waiting room. Brandon had left, but Vanessa remained, and when she saw me, she stood up. Can we talk? She asked. Just for a minute? We walked to a quieter corner of the waiting area. She looked uncertain, which had become her default expression around me. I wanted to thank you for coming, she said. I know it wasn't easy given everything that's happened, but your mother needed you here, even if she couldn't quite say it. Why are you here? I asked. You and Brandon aren't together anymore. No, she said. But your family was important to me for a long time. And when your mother called to tell me what happened, I came because she needed support and I was in a position to give it. That's what people do. They show up. That's fair. But it doesn't really answer why you're talking to me specifically. She smiled slightly. Because I've been thinking a lot about what you did. Building something extraordinary, while letting everyone believe you were struggling. And I realized it wasn't just about proving your family wrong or protecting your work from interference. It was about understanding that sometimes the only way to become who you're supposed to be is to stop trying to be who other people expect you to be. And I think I'm finally learning that lesson myself. Good, I said. That's a hard lesson. Worth learning though. I left the hospital around midnight. The drive back to Bellevue was quiet, Seattle streets empty except for the occasional bus or late-night worker heading home. I thought about my father in that hospital bed, diminished and apologetic. About my mother in the waiting room, frightened of losing her husband. About Brandon, absent because he probably didn't know how to process any of this. About Vanessa showing up because it was the right thing to do even when she had no obligation. Family was complicated. More complicated than I'd wanted to acknowledge for the past year. Cutting them off had been easier than trying to maintain relationships built on fundamental misunderstandings. But my father's heart attack had reminded me that clean breaks aren't always possible. That people you've written off can surprise you. That mortality has a way of putting small grievances in perspective, even when the grievances don't feel small at all. I didn't know what would happen next with my family. Whether my father's apology would translate into actual changed behavior or just be another performance, playing the role of contrite parent because the situation demanded it. Whether my mother would find the courage to acknowledge her own complicity, or just keep playing peacemaker without taking responsibility. Whether Brandon and I would ever have a conversation that wasn't filtered through resentment and competition. But I knew what would happen next with TechFlow. We'd keep building. The UN partnership would move forward. The humanitarian platform would expand. The commercial business would grow. And I'd keep showing up every day to do work that mattered, surrounded by people who valued substance over appearance, impact over status, honest effort over performed success. That was enough. It had to be enough. Because at the end of the day, the only person's approval I really needed was my own. And I'd earned that 3 years ago when I decided to build something real regardless of whether anyone else understood or believed in it. My name is Ethan Parker. I built $1 billion company while my family thought I was failing. I did it quietly, deliberately, without asking permission or seeking validation. And when the truth came out, it changed everything and nothing. My work continued. My purpose remained clear. And I learned that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to be defined by other people's limitations. The rest is just details. The months following my father's heart attack unfolded with a kind of cautious distance that neither fully repaired our relationship nor completely severed it. He recovered slowly, spending weeks in cardiac rehabilitation, and adjusting to medications that made him tired and irritable. My mother called every few days with updates, her voice always carrying that careful hopefulness that suggested she was trying to rebuild something she couldn't quite name. I visited twice more while he was recovering, brief conversations in their living room on Mercer Island that felt more like diplomatic negotiations than family gatherings. We talked about his health, about safe topics like the weather and Seattle sports teams, carefully avoiding anything that might lead back to the fundamental disagreements that had defined our relationship. He asked about TechFlow once, a vague question about how business was going, and I gave an equally vague answer. Good. Growing. We're expanding into new markets. He nodded like he understood, but I could see in his eyes that he didn't really want details. He just wanted to check a box to prove he was trying without actually having to engage with who I'd become. Brandon and I crossed paths at one of these visits. He was dropping off some documents our father needed to sign for the business, and we ended up standing in the driveway together, while our mother fussed over something inside. The silence stretched between us, heavy with everything we weren't saying. The UN partnership, he finally said, not looking at me. I read about it in the Seattle Times. That's significant. It is, I said. More silence. Then, almost reluctantly, he added, what you're doing with the humanitarian applications, that matters more than the commercial stuff. Even if it's not as profitable. I appreciate you saying that. He finally looked at me directly. I was wrong about you. About what you were capable of. I don't know if that means anything to you now, but I wanted to say it. It means something, I said. Not enough to erase 3 years of being treated like I was wasting my life, but something. He nodded and got in his Range Rover and drove away, and I stood in that driveway thinking about how strange it was that growth often looked like people admitting they'd been wrong instead of celebrating that they'd been right. Nobody in my family was happy for my success in the way you'd expect family to be happy. They were just coming to terms with having been so completely mistaken about who I was and what I could do. TechFlow continued its trajectory through the winter and into spring. The UN partnership was officially announced in March, a massive deployment that would integrate our humanitarian platform into disaster response operations across 43 countries. The technical challenges were staggering, the coordination requirements even more so, but we had a team now that could handle complexity at scale. Amanda had built out our operations to the point where we could take on projects that would have been impossible 2 years earlier. Dr. Okonkwo's predictive intervention framework was being integrated into the platform, allowing us to not just respond to crises but anticipate them. We were getting better at reading the signals that preceded disasters, the cascading factors that turn manageable situations into humanitarian emergencies. Weather data, infrastructure monitoring, political instability indicators, disease surveillance, population movement patterns. All of it feeding into models that could forecast where intervention would be needed and what resources would be required. It wasn't perfect. We missed things, made predictions that didn't pan out, allocated resources that ended up not being needed. But we were right more often than we were wrong, And the margin of improvement translated directly into lives saved and suffering prevented. That made every late night, every technical challenge, every frustrating coordination meeting worth it. Sophie Brennan had been in East Africa for 8 months when she sent me an email that fundamentally shifted how I thought about the work we were doing. She'd been coordinating supply distribution in a region where prolonged drought had created severe food insecurity, using our platform to optimize delivery routes and track inventory across dozens of distribution points. The email was long, detailed, describing both successes and frustrations with the kind of honesty that comes from being in the field rather than theorizing from an office. But it was the final paragraph that stayed with me. She wrote that she'd met a mother at one of the distribution centers who told her that her youngest child would have died without the food supplies that had arrived when they did. Not might have died. Would have died. The child had been severely malnourished, hours or maybe a day away from the kind of organ failure that becomes irreversible. The supplies that our platform had routed to that particular village at that particular time had quite literally saved that child's life. And the mother wanted Sophie to thank whoever had made it possible for aid to reach them so quickly. I read that email 3 times, sitting in my office in Bellevue with the Seattle skyline spread out beyond my windows. All the technical complexity, all the algorithms and optimization models and predictive frameworks, had ultimately resulted in one mother going home with her child still alive. That was what the work actually meant. Not valuations or market share or any of the metrics that usually define success. Just that one child who would grow up because we'd built something that worked. I forwarded the email to the entire TechFlow team with a single line of commentary. This is why we build. The response was immediate and emotional. Engineers who normally communicated in technical jargon sent messages about why they'd joined the company, what the humanitarian work meant to them, how grateful they were to be part of something that mattered beyond profit. Amanda called me directly, her voice thick with emotion, and said that she'd never been more proud of an organization she'd helped build. That evening, I did something I hadn't done in months. I called my mother, not because she'd called me first or because there was some obligation to fulfill, but because I wanted to share something that mattered with someone who'd known me my whole life. I told her about Sophie's email, about the mother and the child, about what it meant to know that the work we were doing had that kind of tangible impact. My mother listened quietly, and when I finished, she was silent for a long moment. "I'm proud of you," she finally said, and her voice had a quality I couldn't remember hearing before. Not proud because you built a successful company or because you proved everyone wrong. Proud because you built something that saves lives. That's extraordinary, Ethan. That's the kind of success that actually matters. "Thank you," I said, and meant it. We talked for another 20 minutes, a real conversation for the first time in years. She asked questions about the humanitarian work, genuinely interested rather than just making polite noise. She told me about a charity she'd been volunteering with, helping refugee families resettle in Seattle, and how she'd started thinking differently about what service and contribution really meant. It wasn't a complete reconciliation. Too much had happened for that. But it was a start, a recognition that maybe we could build something new instead of trying to repair what had been broken. My father called a week later. The conversation was shorter, more hesitant, but it carried the same unexpected sincerity. He'd read an article about the UN partnership, and he wanted me to know that what I was doing was important. He didn't apologize again. Didn't try to take credit or offer advice I hadn't asked for. Just acknowledged that I'd built something meaningful and that he respected that. These weren't dramatic transformations. My family didn't suddenly become different people who understood me perfectly or celebrated my successes without reservation. But they were trying, in their limited ways, to see me more clearly, to acknowledge that their assumptions had been wrong, and that I'd charted a path they'd never anticipated or valued, and that path had led somewhere that actually mattered. Summer brought new challenges and opportunities. TechFlow was approached by a coalition of climate scientists who wanted to use our predictive platform to model and prepare for climate-related displacement. Rising sea levels, increasingly severe weather events, areas becoming uninhabitable due to heat or drought. They estimated that within the next decade, hundreds of millions of people would be displaced by climate change, and the existing systems for managing that kind of mass migration were completely inadequate. It was ambitious to the point of being overwhelming, but it was also exactly the kind of challenge that made me remember why I'd started TechFlow in the first place. To solve problems that mattered. To build systems that made the world function better in ways that actually affected people's lives. We spent the summer building out capabilities for climate displacement modeling, partnering with universities and research institutions, integrating new data sources and predictive models. It was some of the most complex work we'd ever attempted, trying to account for countless variables across decades-long timelines. But piece by piece, the system took shape. By September, we had a prototype that could model climate displacement scenarios with enough accuracy to start planning interventions. Not preventing the displacement that required political and economic changes far beyond what any platform could achieve, but preparing for it. Identifying where people would likely move, what resources they'd need, how to coordinate between origin and destination regions to make the transition less catastrophic. The work consumed me completely in the best possible way. TechFlow had evolved beyond anything I'd originally envisioned. We weren't just optimizing supply chains anymore. We were building infrastructure for human resilience in the face of global challenges that would define the coming century. It was humbling and energizing in equal measure. In October, Forbes reached out again. They wanted to do a follow-up piece 2 years after the original article, The Invisible Billionaire, Building Systems for a Changing World. I almost declined, tired of being the story instead of letting the work speak for itself. But I talked it through with Amanda and Dr. Okonkwo, and they both convinced me that visibility mattered. That being public about what we were building could inspire others, could shift conversations about what technology should be used for, could help recruit the kind of talent we needed to keep scaling. The interview was different this time. Less about my family, less about the dramatic reveal, more about the actual work and where it was heading. The journalist asked smart questions about the technical challenges, the ethical considerations of predictive modeling, the balance between humanitarian mission and commercial sustainability. When the article came out in December, it painted a picture of TechFlow as an organization that had matured beyond its founder's story, that had become something larger and more important than any individual narrative. My family read it, all of them. My mother sent a text saying she'd shared it with everyone she knew. Brandon forwarded it to his own network with a note I only heard about secondhand, saying that his brother was doing work that mattered more than anything happening in commercial real estate. My father called to say he'd included the article in a presentation to his board of directors, as an example of the kind of innovation that Seattle should be known for. These small gestures, accumulated over months, started to feel like something resembling reconciliation. Not forgiveness exactly, because I wasn't sure I was ready to fully forgive. But acknowledgement, recognition, a willingness to see me as I actually was rather than who they'd assumed I should be. On Christmas Eve, I went to my parents' house for dinner. The first family gathering I'd attended since that disastrous Sunday almost 2 years earlier. Brandon was there with a new girlfriend, someone who worked in environmental law, and seemed genuinely nice. My mother had cooked. The house smelled like the holidays I remembered from childhood. And for a few hours we existed together without the weight of everything unsaid crushing the conversation. It wasn't perfect. There were awkward moments, topics we all avoided, things that remained unresolved. But there was also laughter, genuine interest in each other's lives, my father asking real questions about the climate displacement project and actually listening to the answers. Brandon telling a story about a mistake he'd made at work and everyone laughing, including him. A kind of vulnerability I'd never seen from him before. As I was leaving, my father walked me out to my car. The night was clear and cold, stars visible despite the city lights. Rare for Seattle. "I'm glad you came," he said. "Your mother was worried you wouldn't." "I almost didn't. But you did. That means something." He put his hand on my shoulder, tentative, like he wasn't sure he had the right. "I know I can't undo the past. Can't take back the years of being wrong about you. But I want you to know that I see you now. What you've built, what you're trying to do. I see it and I'm proud. Even if I don't have any right to be. You're my father," I said. "You always had the right. You just didn't exercise it when it would have mattered most." "I know. But maybe it's not too late to start." "Maybe," I said. "We'll see." I drove home through empty streets, thinking about second chances and whether they were earned or given. Whether forgiveness required forgetting or just willingness to move forward despite remembering everything. I didn't have answers. Just questions and the recognition that some relationships were worth the effort of reconstruction, even when the foundation had been damaged beyond full repair. My name is Ethan Parker. I built a billion-dollar company while my family thought I was failing. I did it for reasons that had nothing to do with them and everything to do with solving problems that mattered. And in the end, the work became bigger than any family drama, more important than any vindication or validation. The humanitarian platform saved lives. The climate modeling prepared for a future that was coming whether anyone was ready or not. And somewhere along the way, I learned that success wasn't about proving people wrong. It was about building something so meaningful that the opinions of people who doubted you simply stopped mattering. The rest was just learning to live with imperfect reconciliations and incomplete resolutions, showing up anyway, doing the work anyway, becoming the person you were meant to be regardless of who thought you could or couldn't do it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.